Well, good morning. I'm so glad to be with all of you today on this Thursday morning as we are talking about the Industrial Revolution, which I'm sure is something that everyone is super excited to talk about on a Thursday. And so this week, we've been kind of going over the beginning of the Revolution. This week, we have also been talking about some of the implications of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, the first time that we were together talking about the Industrial Revolution, we talked about some of the background, how this Industrial Revolution, it had started in Great Britain. We talked about during the Industrial Revolution how there was an agricultural revolution that had come first. We looked at and talked about how there was these new crops as a result of the Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange had introduced these foods that had never been part of the old world before. Foods like corn and foods like the potato. And that, the Columbian Exchange is something that we know, we talk about, is it's something that changed the world. One of the reasons why it changed the world was that it had changed the world by introducing these foods that were super easy to grow, they were super easy to maintain, and that actually increased global population tremendously. So we talked about the agricultural revolutions. We talked about the fact that because there was these cheap foods that were now available from the Americas that came over to the old world, like corn and like the potato, that world population increased. That meant a couple things. It meant that not everyone needed to be farming. That meant a couple things. It meant that now the infant mortality rate began to decline. That meant that there's these move of people from the farms to factories because these people, they are looking for jobs, or there's so many people now, and they're now moving to the cities as a result of this agricultural revolution. So without Chris Columbus coming to the New World, without this interaction bringing old to the new, we would not have the Industrial Revolution. All these things are tied together. We mentioned last time that there was a couple of advantages to the British. They had some natural advantages. We had mentioned that the British they were an island. They had all these great natural ports, good for trade. We had mentioned that they were blessed with these amazing natural deposits of coal. We had mentioned the fact that they have rivers that are a easy transportation network ready for them. And so they also had something kind of interesting. They have this illegal tradition of protecting property and protecting ideas. And if I have a legal system where I know that the government's not just going to knock on my door and take stuff away from me, I am willing to take risks. That's one of the things that we need to have a stable Western culture. We also talked a little bit about the technological revolution. We talked about pottery. We talked about that, these new products that Europeans are drinking, like coffee and like tea. We need better quality cups and mugs. And so we even see a revolution in mass production where I am breaking down the production of things to small, repeatable steps. And that means that my skill set as someone on this, almost this early assembly line, my skill set goes down and my income goes down too. But there's a benefit to that. The benefit is that things become cheaper and more accessible. We also talked last time about the role of technology, things that would make, cotton cloth even cheaper and more accessible. We talked about the role of Eli Whitney, who, unbeknownst to him, his invention, the cotton gin, will make it cheaper for you and me to have cotton shirts, but it's also going to be a piece of technology that's going to cause it to make even more sense for us to own slaves to produce cotton in the American South. So that's an unintended consequence. We talked a little bit about the steam engine, and we are going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later today. So the next thing that I want to talk about now is from this original handout that we looked at earlier in the week together on how industrialization spreads. And we're going to talk about how it spread in Western Europe. And we also want to talk about how industrialism spread in outside of Europe and how that's going to look just a little different. So first of all, how did industrialism spread? Well, France and Germany, it says that France, well, their industrialization was delayed by something. You might remember that in the 1800s, that there was something that really caused France to go through upheaval and turmoil and a roller coaster of events that France went through in the 1800s. And because of that, because of the chaos, we'll write down of the of the French Revolution, that is what delays France entering into industrialization. France has the chaos of the French Revolution. And so that's like one of the reasons why France is going to be a little bit behind everyone else. You know, the British are going to go through this industrial revolution first, and forever, Britain and France have been kind of like on the same level. Forever, Britain and France have been rivals. They've been in the same ballpark of development and empire. But now the fact that the first part of the 1800s, France has fallen apart. In the first part of the 1800s, there's a reign of terror. There's the execution of all these peoples. There's all this societal uncertainty. This is one of the reasons why France is going to enter the industrial revolution a bit late. Now, Germany also is going to enter into the industrial revolution a bit late, but it's not because of civil war or revolution in Germany. Germany, you might remember, has another problem. And the problem that Germany has in the first part of the 1800s is Germany doesn't even exist. You might remember that there is no country called Germany. We studied that there's a term called nationalism. And nationalism in the 1800s does one of two things. Nationalism can either bring your various fragmented smaller countries together around a common ethnic or cultural identity. And we saw that happening with two countries. We saw that happening with Germany. There was a bunch of small, fragmented, independent German-speaking states. And Germany, at the end of the 1800s, consolidated and all came together. The second example of how nationalism can bring countries together, hopefully you remember, hopefully you recall, is in Italy. There actually was not a single country called Italy. There was a bunch of fragmented countries that spoke Italian. And we see the unification of Germany and we see the unification of Italy as examples of how nationalism can bring people groups together. Just like we saw how nationalism can bring people groups together, we also know that nationalism can tear people apart. We see that those tensions in the Ottoman Empire, in the Austrian Empire, and in the Russian Empire. And that's really the problem that Germany has here. It says France's industrialization was delayed by a lack of political unification, that there was this original lack of political unification. So that's one of the big problems. France has just this chaos in the French Revolution. Germany is a little slow, a little late entering to the Industrial Revolution because Germany wasn't even a thing. They lacked political unification. Well, what about the United States? Well, we know the Industrial Revolution, it begins in Britain, but what about us? Well, it says that the United States, we go through this incredible transformation. From 1800 to 1900, the United States would become a leading industrial power, a leading industrial power. This is like one of the big turning points for the United States. This is one of the biggest moments where in 1800, we're just birthed as a new nation in 1776. We do really well. I mean, when we signed that Treaty of Paris, ending our war for independence with the British full on give us all the land east of the Mississippi River. With the signing of independence document with the British, our country like doubles in size. And then with Napoleon selling us the Louisiana Purchase, we grow even more. And this process continues to unfold in the 1800s, which is why we talked about last time this concept of manifest destiny. It made sense that we were going to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And so we see in this time we are becoming a world leading industrial power. One of the things that really helped us to become this world leading industrial power, it says, was that we had plenty of workers in American factories were willing to work for low wages, and that was provided by mass migration. That was provided by mass migration. One of the things about industrialization is you need to have a source of labor to work in these factories. You need to have people readily available to be doing all this mass manufacturing. We saw that in Britain, as there was something we studied the other day called the enclosure movement, how it used to be that anyone could like farm in areas called the commons. But in the 1800s, the British began to charge people to farm. And that meant a lot of people didn't have money for access to the land. So they moved to the factories, places like Manchester in England, to get a job. Well, we also have a lot of poor people coming to the United States. People who are looking for jobs, people from Italy, people from Germany, people from Great Britain moving to the United States. And all these people are our workforce. We see a lot of mass migration. Well, we're doing pretty well. We do kind of well during the Industrial Revolution. What about Russia? Now, we've talked a lot about Russia. And one of the things about Russia that we have mentioned was Russia compared to Western Europe's industrialization. How does Russia compare to the rest of Europe? Particularly, how does Russia compare to Western Europe? Well, it says that they were behind. One of the biggest examples of Russia always being behind, we said, was that the rest of the world, the rest of Europe had gotten rid of serfdom like at the end of the Middle Ages. After there was the pandemic, you might remember there was something called the Black Death that wiped out huge percentages of Europe's population. And that changed their society forever. Something like 1 out of every 3 Europeans died in the Black Death. It's going to be really hard for your society to be unchanged after going something through that. Right now in 2020, we have this pandemic, with this virus, this COVID-19 virus. And this virus, is for sure something that's going to change our society, even though it's not as detrimental as the Black Death was. The Black Death killed 1 out of every 3 people. We think in the United States that, this could at the most kill 1%. But think about like how this 1% virus is impacting our country. We're locked out. Our businesses. This 1% virus is changing our society dramatically. The Black Death didn't kill 1%. It killed 33% of Europeans. And one of the things that changed dramatically was serfdom. Serfdom, this idea of poor people tied to the land, it went away as a result of that. Well, while the rest of Europe did away with serfs, these servants tied to the land, Russia still had them. That was like the biggest example of Russia really being behind everyone else. It says that they did do some things. There were some movements that they do have. And one of the best examples of Russia starting industrialization has to do with Russia's expansion. Just like we moved from the Atlantic to the Pacific, well, Russia does the same thing as well. They move from the west, where Moscow is, moving to the east to the Pacific Ocean. And to get there, they built, on your handout, what's called the Trans-Siberian Railroad. This thing is measured at 5,772 miles. This measures at 5,772 miles, this amazing network of steel across the Siberian landscape, the Trans-Siberian Railroad. This railroad linked Russia with East Asia. And so more we'll talk more tomorrow about how our transcontinental railroad changes our society. We talked a little bit about the telegraph yesterday, but tomorrow we'll talk about the train system. But Russia does have the beginning, and the Russian economy would remain until 1917 overwhelmingly agricultural. So even though there are some things that they do to try to enter into modernization, for the most part, Russia remains agricultural, and any economy who's based on agriculture alone is not in a situation to become a leading world power. You have to make the transition from farming being the main thing you're doing to industry being the main thing that you're doing. Well, what about Japan? Well, Japan is going to really be different because Japan's an Asian country. And if you were to guess right away, well, how are Asian countries going to do? Well, if you've noticed the general pattern in the 1800s or the 1700s is that white European nations are on the rise and non-white European countries are on the decline. Africa is being beat up. They are being abused in various ways. The Americas were carved out and conquered. And we see that much of Asia is going to suffer the same fate, but Japan is going to prove to be different. It says that Japan would be the Asian country that was the most industrialized. Japan's going to be the country that was the most industrialized. And this is where Japan and China take two very different approaches. You might remember that in Chinese culture, the Chinese for various reasons thought, man, we are the best culture on the planet. China, we're number one. That, we are the kingdom. We're the center of everything that's worth knowing. And the Chinese felt that way so much that there was a time that they were sending out fleets of ships in the 1400s all around the world. They were sailing ships from China all the way to Africa. They were bringing like giraffes back to China under a Muslim eunuch named Zheng He. And eventually they said, you know what, why are we wasting all this money reaching out to the world? They were very ethnocentric, believing that their culture was the best. And eventually they said, you know what would be better than going out to Africa and India and the Middle East? It'd be better just like burn our ships, because, is there anything that we really, really need on trading with other countries? No, there's nothing we really, really need to trade from other countries. So the Chinese cut off the outside world. You might remember later that the Jesuits were eventually going to be kind of shut out. They'll be invited in briefly to China, but then they'll be shut out. And Japan also, we talked about how they were at first open to the Jesuits coming in, but then as a lot of poor Japanese were converting to the Catholic faith, they similarly shut them out. Now, even though they want to shut out European religious ideas, the Japanese know that they should not shut out European industrial ideas. And so Japan does something no other country really does in Asia. They industrialize. It says that not wanting to be taken over by Europeans, that they focused on modernization. They focused on modernization. They did not want to be conquered. They didn't want to be beat up like they're going to see India be conquered and taken over. They don't want to have the same fate that we'll see China has. China's going to go through a humiliating period of being beat up, abused, and conquered indirectly by Europeans. And Japan knows they don't want that to happen. And so they want to focus on modernization. It says Japan was willing to learn from the United States and Europe, leading to Japan's westernization. Westernization means to become like Europe. Westernization means to become like the United States. And that's really the transformation that makes Japan different from China and different from India, is that while a lot of Asian countries are trying to avoid or hoping to ignore European influence, China says, you know what, you can't ignore Europe and America. And we can either be like them, or we're going to be conquered by them. And so that's what Japan decides to do westernization. In fact, Japan would become a leading military and would become a military and industrial leader, a military industrial leader. So that's going to be something that is remarkable. Japan is going to start, we'll talk about more manufacturing to a degree, having train tracks to a degree, having electricity to a degree that we only really see in other European countries, and that's going to be really impressive for them. Let's talk a little bit about shifts in manufacturing. I want to talk about India, and then we're going to transition to some new material talking about coal, steel, and radio. So what about India? Well, we talked about the example of Russia. They have a few efforts of modernization like the Trans-Siberian Railroad, but for the most part, Russia's not really transformed. We talked about Japan, which really does learn the lesson that unless they modernize, they're going to be taken over. But what about India? I mean, India has been like super important for such a long time. Like when the Portuguese, the first white people ever get to India, they're like, wow, this is an incredible place. They have incredible wealth. They have incredible products. And when the Europeans come to trade with the Indians for luxury products like silk, for spices, things like that, the Indians kind of just like laugh at the Europeans. I mean, that's the level of, lack of equality we have. The Indian economy is like so much more advanced, but that's going to change. And India is going to go a place of incredible wealth and power and privilege to really being taken over by the Europeans, by the British, ultimately. And that's sad because India had done so well for so long. It was one of our oldest river valley civilizations. They actually gave us numbers. We call them Arabic numerals, but really the numbers that we use for like our math classes, the numbers 1, 2, 3, all those different numbers, we actually get those numbers from India. And so there's so many things that we got from India. The numbers we use every day, the numbers on the top of your keyboard, the numbers on your phone, those are all given to us from Indian culture. And India is going to find itself in a situation where they are going to be taken over by the British. It says the British came to rule India in the 1800s, and they at first came indirectly. It was not the British government at first, it was British companies at first. It says that the British East India Company, they dominated trade. And as they came to dominate trade, replacing the Portuguese. I mean, you might remember the Portuguese were the first ones there, but the British have invested into their navy, and they have actually, this British company replaced the role of the Indian Navy. So the Indian Navy as like a power for trade, it goes away and is replaced by this private company, the British East India Company. From 1757 to 1858, the British East India Company, will write down, they controlled India. And, we think about sometimes the power of corporations today, like how powerful Amazon is or how powerful YouTube is. But what we see is that corporations have been powerful for some amount of time. And here at this time, a corporation, the British East India Company, actually ruled India. It says that this period was known as company rule. It was the time that this whole nation of India, millions of people, were ruled by not their own leaders, not even by another government, but by a corporation. We call this period company rule. It says that the British limited Indian ability to develop a mining industry, that the British, they understood that mining, coal, iron, that had helped Britain become a leader in the Industrial Revolution. And they didn't want India to develop those capabilities on their own. And actually, as the British will come to like directly rule India, they're going to actually limit and not allow the Indians to actually develop those same technologies and industries that would help Britain become an industrial power. They don't want that for India. They want India not to be independent, but to be dependent. They feared that they would use it to rebel against British rule. Because if you have your own resources, then you don't need mine. Also, like, frankly, if you're mining for resources, you can make ammunition, you can make guns, you can make materials. So the British wanted the Indians to be dependent on them, and they limited what they were able to do. We'll see this tension between the British and the Indians continue until finally a famous man that you know, Gandhi, is going to help lead the Indian independence movement from the British. And so the United States, we have a lot in common with different parts of the world. We have a lot in common with Kenya. Kenya was a British colony, and then they received their independence. Uganda was a British colony. They received their independence. India was a British colony. They received their independence after protesting for it. We received ours, similarly protesting and fighting. So we have this common bond, these cousins of colonization in East Africa, these cousins of colonization in India. We'll see this play out as we continue to go. What about textile production? So we talked about mining and how the British didn't allow mining, but what about making shirts, making cotton, making textiles? It says both of these nations, Egypt and India, had dominated in the production of textiles. That cotton cloth in Egypt was like a really big deal, and that textile production in India was a really big deal. In fact, like the best textiles that were made, some of the best quality stuff was being made in Egypt and in India. Even to this day, you go to Target and you buy towels. Sometimes you'll see like the label Egyptian cotton, things like that. Well, British factories could now make textiles faster and cheaper. For a long time, Egypt made a lot of money from textile production. For a long time, Egypt and India dominated world trade because you could get high quality cotton textiles from these countries. Well, now the British are making these in factories, and they're making them way faster and way cheaper than these countries could. The wealth of the textile industries of these nations, we'll write down, was destroyed. It was destroyed. So now we have a shift, a change over time, a change where India and Egypt were going to make a significant amount of money selling cotton textiles to Europe. And now, because of the Industrial Revolution, Europe looks at these countries and says, I might want your raw cotton, I might want your unprocessed cotton, but I just want you to ship it now to England. We'll make it. We've got factories. We've got technological abilities to mass produce. You don't need to do that anymore. And so now India went from making a lot of money in the textile industry to really just being a supplier at best for the British. Okay, so now we're going to transition for our last 30 minutes of time to talk about coal, steel, and radio. So technology in the industrial age, and we'll talk just a little bit right now about the role of coal. So we talked about the role of cotton. Now let's go ahead and talk about the role of coal. There's a guy that you should know by name, a guy named James Watt. And in 1765, he invented a version of the steam engine. And that's going to be really important because this steam engine made an inexpensive way to harness power from burning coal. And so as this steam engine is burning coal, this is going to be used to boil water to create steam. And you probably have studied this just a little bit, but as this coal is being burned, it's boiling water, it's fueling steam, creating steam. It's going to turn turbines, and that's going to generate electricity. It says that this steam was used to generate electricity to power machinery in textile factories. And so, that's the whole thing, is like, I want clothes, you want clothes. The British, one of the first things that they're going to be using their production of power is to fuel textile factories, to make clothing cheaper and quicker. So James Watt, definitely a guy you should know by name. His invention is now the steam engine. It's going to help to power machinery and textile factories. And these textiles are going to be made cheaper and quicker for sure. Well, not only do we have this steam engine by James Watt, but we also not only have textile industries being run by it, but we also have water transportation being changed by the steam engine. In fact, it says that steamships revolutionized sailing. Think about how sailing had been done forever. Sailing had been done forever by how fast I can row. You might remember, like, the ancient Greeks would have these ships with like hundreds of slaves on the bottom, and these guys are rowing as part of it. You might clearly remember that sails are being used throughout international trade networks. That the Indian Ocean is they had the sail called the Dhow, the ship called the Dhow with these lateen sails, and all these different things were used to try to make wind power more effective. But now the steamship is going to change that. In fact, now energy production, we'll write down, was mobile and dependable. It was mobile and dependable because I don't have to depend on it being a windy day. I don't have to depend on me being able to make the wind pattern to go where I need it to go. Now with coal, now with these engines, energy production was mobile and dependable. There was other ways that Europeans had produced energy that had been innovative and had been great at the time. For example, we've talked about the water wheel. The problem with water wheels, you have a river and you set up this water wheel, and as the river flows, it turns it, and then you can connect that up to mechanisms to like grind grain or pound cloth, just various other things like that. And that's great and all, but those water wheels are in a fixed location along the bank of a river. And so it's never going to move. Like, I can only have a factory right here by a river. And by the way, that factory by the bank of a river is only going to work when it's flowing and there's like good river flow. Can never move it. And that's going to be what we'll see is going to be. That's one of the things we're going to see is to be very different with the steam engine, because I can set up these factories anywhere. I can take coal anywhere and I can burn it anywhere. Windmills were something that we used to have. We still do have windmills, but windmills are dependent on the ever-changing weather conditions. Ever-changing weather conditions. On a windy day, that's great. Or it also even depends that maybe the part of your country, West Texas, we have a lot of windmills, even in West Texas today and South Texas today. Some places it doesn't blow enough that we would even be able to have that. So it's an improvement. Ocean-going ships were no longer dependent on the wind. Ocean-going ships were no longer dependent on the wind. Now that is going to create a problem, though, because what we'll need to do if I'm going to sail around the world is I need a place to refuel, because even though I'm not dependent on the wind anymore, I need fuel. And I don't know if you've noticed, but the Pacific Ocean is kind of big, right? And so I'm not going to be able to make it across the entire Pacific Ocean. I'm not going to make it across the Atlantic Ocean or Indian Ocean without some places to stop and to refuel. And so it says that all along critical points along sea-based trade routes, countries established what's called coaling stations. We established what's called coaling stations. This is where you would refuel, where you would have stockpiles of coal. You could stop, you could get water, you could get food, and very importantly, get coal. It says that isolated islands in the Pacific became essential refueling stations. Essential refueling stations. And so there's two maps on your handout. The first map is a handout of the British. and how they have all these little dots. Why would I care about that dot? Why would I care about that island? I care about that dot, and I care about that island because it's an island I can stop and refuel. There's a second map with the United States in pink, and you can see that there's all these islands in the Pacific. Why would we care about random island in the Pacific, including why would I care about the random island of Hawaii? Well, I care about that because if you look at that map, Hawaii is halfway to Asia. There's markets in Asia. I want to buy raw materials from Asia. I want to sell things to Asia. But to get to to get to Asia from California, I need to have coaling stations, and that's what we do. It says coal also made possible the production of iron. Coke, and it says below that, this was made possible by the introduction of something called Coke. It's spelled like the drink, Coke. But this is not something you want to drink. We've actually talked about this before, that Coke was a refined form of coal. And this made it cheaper to make iron because it was a better form of coal. It burned better. It got higher temperatures. It made good quality iron cheaper. Finally, there is something called a second industrial revolution. That begins in 3 different countries: the United States, Germany, and Britain. The second industrial revolution. And this is called the second one because it's like a second phase. It occurred in the late 19th century and it continued into the early 20th century. So it occurred in the late 19th and continued to the late 20th century. And one of the biggest things about this second industrial revolution was steel. And now steel is yet stronger than iron. We have this progression. We have Stone Age tools, we have Bronze Age tools, we have Iron Age tools. Well, steel is even better. Steel is an alloy of iron and carbon together. And iron and carbon together, it says that this was achieved through what was called the Bessemer process that helped with removing impurities. And that now that we're taking impurities out of the metal, removing impurities, and makes this metal stronger. This allowed steel to become stronger and more flexible. And with steel being stronger and more flexible, we can do things with steel that we could not do with iron. It says this would allow for the construction of bridges and tall buildings. Bridges and tall buildings, the skeletons that we see for the skyscrapers that we know and that we build is only possible because of steel and the Bessemer process. Another big change in the second industrial revolution is a new fossil fuel, or really the use of fossil fuels continues with this new form. Oil, it says, was a fossil fuel. One of the first things that we used oil was to get something called kerosene. In 1847, kerosene was extracted from petroleum and helped with producing light. And what a change that is as well, because for most Americans, your day started when there was sun and your day ended when the sun set. Imagine if your life was dominated by the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun, and there was nothing you could do, no schoolwork, no meaningful socialization, because there's just no light. Kerosene would change all that, producing light. Also, it says the creation of the internal combustion engine would also be able to burn petroleum to run an engine. Just like we were burning coal to run an engine, now with the internal combustion engine, we're now going to be able to burn petroleum to run an engine. And this would later allow for the invention of cars and planes. So think how quickly things are going, how quickly technology is changing. In a few decades, oil will become one of the most important fossil fuels. We don't hear about oil to the really end of the 1800s. And then now in 2020, oil is an essential thing that helps the entire world run so quickly. Something that became nothing became everything. Electrification, it says, would also begin in the 1880s, and electrification would lead in the 1890s to street lights and street and electric trains, street lights and electric trains. And we'll talk more about this as well, how electricity changes, with street lights, areas become safer. With subways and trains run on electricity, you can live farther from downtown. You can now, suburbs can be a thing. You can take the train into town. You can live outside of the downtown area. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. Another thing that's super essential is something called a patent, which is on your handout. And the patent was a legal protection for an idea. We've talked about this before, because with all these developments with electricity and the technologies that come with this, I don't want to get ripped off my idea. One of the things the United States, one of the things that Europe has are patents protecting ideas. And you might remember we talked about this last time, the protection of property was an essential development in the Western economy. This is what gave people the willingness to take risks, to figure things out, to invent things, knowing that I can get a patent, I can get legal protection for my idea. That's essential for the development of Western economy. In 1876, a patent was given to a man named Alexander Graham Bell for his invention of his version of the telephone. And that's a huge thing. So we talked about the telegraph last time together. Now we have a telephone in 1876. And in 1886, almost 10 years later, the quality of the phone was improved by the work of another inventor, a guy named Thomas Edison. Edison is Edison. Yet another step forward in technology in 1901, a non-American, a guy named Marconi, an Italian physicist named Marconi, sent and received radio waves across the Atlantic Ocean. And so the telegraph was important. We laid cables underneath the Atlantic Ocean. The telephone was important. I can now actually hear the voice by me being tied by a landline with someone hundreds of miles away. But now we have in 1901 another step forward with Marconi creating and testing radio waves that now I can now wirelessly communicate. I have wireless communication, not in 2020, but in 1901, I can now, without a cord connecting me, wirelessly communicate around the world. It says this would help create a new and global mass media, because now in New York City, I can radio broadcast to all around the world. American music can travel around the world. American radio programs, because we didn't have TV shows, we had radio shows at first, radio comedies and radio dramas and radio thrillers that could be heard all around the world. And as a result, American culture would spread globally. American culture will spread globally. So with that kind of brings us to the end of our time today about these developments in the Industrial Revolution, how it looked differently in places like Russia, looked differently in places like Japan and India, how Egypt suffered, how India suffered, how Japan persevered, and how there was a second wave called the Second Industrial Revolution, where we're seeing even more advances. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about global trade and migration and how the cities were transformed by these different levels of technology. Until then, please stay safe. I look forward to working with you guys again soon. Thanks. Bye.